That is not a stick. The thought slammed into Claire Holloway's mind the moment she saw him, the scruffy golden-coated stray trotting up her driveway, tail wagging with unmistakable excitement. She had seen this dog before, lurking near the edges of the neighborhood, watching but never approaching. A cautious creature but friendly in his own way. He had no collar, no owner in sight, just a lone wanderer surviving on whatever scraps he could find. Claire had taken pity on him, leaving bowls of kibble and fresh water on her porch, always careful not to push too hard, letting him decide when, or if he would trust her. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't just here for food. Something long and thin protruded from his jaws, something he held with a peculiar kind of care. The last golden rays of the setting sun struck the object, catching a gleam of pale, weathered white. Claire felt a strange tightening in her chest. That wasn't a stick. It wasn't a chew toy. No. It looked eerily like a bone. Her stomach clenched. Buddy? Her voice was soft, coaxing, despite the unease slithering up her spine. The stray's ears flicked back at the sound of his name, one she had started calling him weeks ago, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he padded right up to her porch and set the object down with deliberate care, as if offering a prize. His pink tongue lolled out, his dark eyes expectant. Claire hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to pretend she hadn't seen it. But she forced herself to kneel, her fingers trembling as they reached forward. The bone was smooth beneath her touch, unnervingly so. Time and weather had bleached it, but it hadn't cracked. It was sturdy, intact, and shaped too precisely to belong to an animal. Her breath caught. It was a ridiculous thought, an overreaction surely. Dogs found bones all the time, leftovers from discarded meals, remnants of buried treasures from wild animals. It didn't have to mean anything sinister. But something about this one felt wrong. She turned it over in her hands, running her thumb along the ridges and grooves. The structure was familiar, unsettlingly so. A sinking feeling coiled in her gut, a quiet voice whispering what she refused to say aloud. This wasn't just a bone. It was human. Claire swallowed hard, her pulse pounding against her ribs. She needed a second opinion, someone who knew bones, someone who could tell her she was being ridiculous. Only one name came to mind. Dr. Howard. The town vet had an eye for detail, an uncanny ability to see what most people overlooked. If anyone could tell her whether she was losing it, it was him. She stood abruptly, ruffling the stray's fur in an almost absent-minded gesture. "Come on, buddy," she murmured. "Let's go see the doc." The dog let out a happy huff and fell into step beside her, as if he understood the gravity of what he had just done. As if he knew this was only the beginning. The short drive to the Holloway Veterinary Clinic was eerily silent. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, his golden fur catching the dim light of the dashboard, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery like this was just another ride. But for Claire, each second stretched unbearably. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her mind racing with questions. Where had he found it? How long had it been there? And the one question she wasn't sure she wanted answered, was there more? By the time she pulled up to the clinic, the sky had darkened into a deep blue. Dr. Howard was locking up, his silhouette framed by the clinic's porch light. The older man turned at the sound of tires crunching against gravel, his brow furrowing in curiosity. "Claire? What brings you by so late?" She stepped out, the bone clutched in her hand. "I think I found something." Or rather, she glanced at Buddy, who wagged his tail eagerly at the sight of the vet. He did. Dr. Howard's gaze flicked to the object in her hand. His easygoing expression faded, replaced by something far more serious. He took a step forward. "Mind if I take a look?" Claire handed it over, watching as he turned it slowly in his hands. The way his lips pressed into a thin line sent another ripple of unease through her. He was silent for too long. The air around them felt heavier, charged with an unspoken dread. Then finally he exhaled. "Claire, this isn't just any bone." A cold shiver trickled down her spine. "What do you mean?" Dr. Howard met her gaze, his face unusually grim. "I'm not a forensic expert," he admitted. "But I've seen enough bones to know this one isn't from any animal I've ever treated." The world tilted beneath her feet. "You're sure?" He nodded, slow and deliberate. "It looks human." For a long moment, Claire couldn't breathe. The streetlights buzzed overhead, the night pressing in on her like a weight she couldn't shake. A human bone. A stray dog had carried a human bone to her doorstep. Her fingers curled into a fist, her nails biting into her palm. "So what do we do?" Dr. Howard hesitated, his gaze flicking toward Buddy, who sat patiently at Claire's feet as if waiting for the next move. "We call the authorities," he said at last. "And we find out where he got it." The words settled between them like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Claire looked down at the stray, a strange mix of fear and gratitude swirling in her chest. He had brought her this, chosen to show her something no one else had seen. But why? And more importantly, what else had he found? As Claire drove home, Buddy sat quietly beside her, staring out the window. The revelation burned in her mind. There was no going back. The authorities would come. They would ask questions. They would search. And then what? Her fingers tightened on the wheel. There was only one way to find out. When she pulled into her driveway, she didn't hesitate this time. She got out of the car, turned to Buddy, and took a deep breath. "Show me." The stray's ears perked up. For a split second, she worried he wouldn't understand, but then, as if he had been waiting for the invitation, he turned and trotted toward the woods behind her house, his nose to the ground, his movements purposeful. Claire followed, her pulse hammering in her ears. The night stretched around them, dark and endless. The air felt heavier with each step. The trees loomed tall, their shadows twisting under the moonlight. The distant hum of crickets filled the silence. The further they went, the deeper the dread settled in her chest. And then Buddy stopped. His tail wagged once. Then he let out a single, low whine. Claire swallowed hard and stepped forward. And what she saw, half buried beneath the tangled roots, made her blood run cold. This was just the beginning. Claire's breath hitched as she followed the dog deeper into the woods, the darkness pressing in around them. He moved with a certainty that sent a fresh wave of unease through her. This wasn't aimless wandering. He knew exactly where he was going. That realization sent a shiver down her spine. The crunch of leaves beneath her boots felt deafening in the eerie silence. The stray's pace slowed, his nose skimming the ground before he came to an abrupt stop. He sniffed, then began to paw at a patch of dirt. Claire hesitated, her pulse hammering as she crouched beside him. The moonlight barely illuminated the spot, but she could see it. The soil was disturbed. Recently, as if something had been dug up. A lump formed in her throat. With a trembling hand, she brushed the dirt aside, fingers pressing into the cool earth. Then she felt it, a hard, curved surface just beneath the soil. Her stomach twisted violently. She dug a little more, just enough to confirm what her gut already screamed at her. Another bone. Slightly larger than the first. The smooth edges and distinct shape sent a chill through her veins. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. "Oh God," she whispered. The stray sat beside her, watching intently, tail giving a single slow wag. He wasn't disturbed. He wasn't alarmed. He was waiting. As if he had done his part, leading her here, and now it was up to her. Claire swallowed hard and fumbled for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through her contacts. The police. She hesitated only for a moment before pressing the call button. The line rang twice. "Holloway Sheriff's Department. This is Deputy Miller." "Deputy, it's Claire. I need you to come to my property. Now." A pause. "Claire? What's going on?" She sucked in a shaky breath, eyes flicking to the bones still half buried in the dirt. I think I just found something. Something bad." Silence. Just long enough to make her wonder if he was about to dismiss her. But then his voice shifted, turning sharp. "Serious. Stay where you are. I'm on my way." She lowered the phone, exhaling unsteadily. The stray nudged her arm, a silent reassurance. She ran a hand over his golden fur, grounding herself in the warmth of his presence. He had brought her here. Why? Was he trying to tell her something? Minutes passed like hours before the crunch of tires on gravel broke the silence. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees. Claire met Miller at the edge of the woods, arms crossed tightly against the night chill. The deputy stepped out of his vehicle, adjusting his belt as he approached, eyes sharp and assessing. "All right, Claire. Show me." She led him to the spot, heart thudding as he knelt down. He pulled on a pair of gloves, lifting the bone carefully. His jaw tightened, his silence stretching. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "You were right to call," he muttered, reaching for his radio. "I'm gonna need backup out here. And a forensic team." Claire's stomach dropped. "So it's human." Miller didn't answer immediately. He turned the bone in the light, his expression grim. "Yeah. And this isn't recent." The stray let out a soft whine, pawing lightly at the ground. Miller watched him carefully before looking back at Claire. "And you said he led you here?" She nodded. "Yeah. Earlier tonight. And before that, he brought me a bone." Miller studied the dog, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "Smart dog." Claire glanced down at him, warmth creeping into her unease. "Yeah, he is. The deputy stood, dusting off his hands. We're gonna need to expand this search. There's no telling how much more is out here. Claire swallowed hard. The weight of the situation settled heavy in her chest. This wasn't just a random discovery. This wasn't just a stray dog picking up bones. This was something bigger. Something dark. Something waiting to be uncovered. And standing in the center of it all was a golden-furred stray who had chosen her doorstep to start it. Claire barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it, the bone, half buried in the dirt, the dog sitting beside it like a sentinel. The weight of the discovery pressed on her chest, making it impossible to settle. The stray curled up on the floor beside her, breathing steady. He hadn't left her side since they returned from the woods, as if he knew she needed the silent comfort. By the time the sun began to rise, Claire was already up, nursing a cup of coffee that did little to clear the fog in her mind. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Deputy Miller. Her pulse jumped as she grabbed it. Morning, Deputy. Morning, Claire. I wanted to give you an update. His tone was clipped, serious. Forensics was out there all night. They're still working, but they confirmed what we suspected. Claire's grip tightened around the mug. It's human. A sigh on the other end. Yeah. And it looks like there might be more. Her stomach twisted. How old? Not sure yet. The bones are weathered. Been there a while. We won't have real answers until the analysis is complete. A pause. I also checked missing persons reports. Nothing concrete yet, but we're not ruling anything out. Claire exhaled slowly. So what happens now? We expand the search. Keep investigating. But I need to ask you something, Claire. She could already feel where this was going. That dog. He led you straight to the bones. Do you have any idea where he might have come from? She glanced down at the stray, who was watching her with those intelligent, knowing eyes. No, she admitted softly. He just started showing up a few weeks ago. I figured he was lost. Miller hummed in thought. Maybe? Or maybe he's been trying to tell someone the truth this whole time. Claire swallowed, her pulse quickening. She looked at the dog again, truly looked at him. And for the first time, she realized he wasn't just a stray. He was a messenger. And whatever story he carried wasn't over yet. Miller's words still rang in Claire's head long after she hung up. If this dog had an owner before, he might be connected to all of this. She exhaled slowly, gripping the phone in her trembling hands. The thought gnawed at her. She had assumed the dog was just a stray, wandering onto her property in search of food, in search of kindness. But now she wasn't so sure. She turned to the golden-furred dog sitting beside her, his deep brown eyes locked onto hers as if he knew exactly what was going through her mind. There was something in his gaze, something knowing. She crouched in front of him, hesitating before reaching out. Her fingers ran through his thick fur, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rise and fall of his breaths. What are you trying to tell me, boy? His tail wagged once, just once. Slow. Measured. Deliberate. Then, as if in response, he pressed his head into her palm, his body leaning into her touch. Claire swallowed hard. A thought, dark and unshakable, formed in the back of her mind. What if this dog wasn't lost at all? What if he had been trying to lead her here on purpose? And if that was true, what else was he trying to show her? A discovery buried in time. Later that morning, with that question still haunting her, Claire made a decision. She grabbed the leash she had bought for him the day before and clipped it onto his collar. His ears perked up instantly, his tail wagging with excitement. But as soon as they stepped outside, Claire felt a shift in his energy. His usual eager movements became focused. His nose hovered close to the ground, his ears flicking at every sound. He wasn't just walking. He was tracking. Claire tightened her grip on the leash, her pulse picking up. What are you leading me to? The crisp morning air filled her lungs as she followed him toward the tree-line. The woods stretched ahead of them, dark and dense, the skeletal branches reaching toward the overcast sky. A breeze rustled through the leaves, but it did nothing to shake the growing unease tightening in her chest. The dog pressed forward, his movements more deliberate now. Claire had taken him for walks around the property before, but this was different. This time, he had a destination. And then suddenly he stopped. His tail went still. His ears perked. A warning. Claire's breath hitched. She followed his gaze, brushing aside a tangle of underbrush, and there, partially buried beneath dirt and leaves, was something out of place. Something unnatural. Something not meant to be found. A rusted metal box. Square. Heavy. Locked. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her chest. She hesitated, staring down at it. The metal was corroded with time, but there was no mistaking what it was. This wasn't just some discarded piece of junk. Someone had buried this. Her hands trembled as she crouched, brushing away more of the dirt, revealing the full shape of it. The dog stood beside her, unmoving, as if he knew she was about to uncover something important. She reached out, fingers hesitant, then pried the lid open. The hinges groaned. Dust swirled into the air. Inside, nestled among the decay of forgotten years, were several aged papers, a tarnished locket, and something wrapped carefully in a faded cloth. Claire's stomach twisted. She reached for the locket first, her fingers fumbling slightly as she forced it open. Inside was a photograph. A young woman. Smiling. Alive. Claire's breath caught. "Who are you?" The dog let out a soft whimper. Her fingers shook as she turned to the papers next, unfolding them with careful hands. The ink had faded, but the words still screamed from the page. "Dear Sam, if you're reading this, something has happened. I don't know who to trust anymore. I think someone is watching me. Please, if I disappear, don't believe what they say." Claire swallowed hard. At the bottom of the page, there was only a first name. Lillian. A sharp snap of a twig behind her sent a jolt of electricity through her body. She jerked upright, heart hammering against her ribs. She spun, eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. Only the wind whispering through the leaves. But still something in her gut told her she wasn't alone. She quickly gathered the letters, the locket, the cloth-wrapped mystery, tucking them into her jacket. The dog pressed against her leg, his ears flicking back. His body was tense, alert. He felt it too. Neither of them waited. They turned and walked away. A name that changes everything. Back inside, Claire spread the contents of the lockbox onto the kitchen table, the warm glow of the overhead light doing nothing to calm the storm raging in her chest. The photograph. The letters. The desperate, fearful plea for help. "Lillian, who were you?" She barely had time to process before her phone buzzed against the counter. She snatched it up, barely glancing at the screen before answering. "Did you find something?" Deputy Miller's voice was tight. "I was about to ask you the same thing." Claire's breath caught. "Why?" A pause. Then, "I ran a search on missing persons in this area over the last 50 years. A woman named Lillian Carter disappeared from this town nearly 4 decades ago. Never found." The room felt colder. Claire's grip tightened on the phone. She looked down at the letters again, her fingers pressing against the brittle, yellowed paper. Her hands trembled. "Miller. I think I just found something that belonged to her." Silence. A beat too long. "Then I'm on my way." Claire barely had time to process before the sound of tires crunching against gravel outside sent a fresh wave of dread rolling through her. The dog lifted his head, ears rigid. Headlights flickered through the window. Deputy Miller's cruiser rolled to a stop in the driveway. For a brief second, relief washed over her. But it was quickly drowned by the crushing weight of reality. She had found something buried. Something that wasn't supposed to resurface. And now she had to face what came next. Miller stepped out of the car, his boots scuffing against the ground as he made his way toward the house. His sharp eyes flicked to Claire, then to the lockbox on the table. He didn't say a word. He just stepped inside. Shut the door behind him. And then, "All right," he said, his gaze shifting between Claire and the dog before settling on the rusted lockbox. "Tell me everything." Miller's words hit Claire like a freight train. She worked at the diner on Main Street. Lived in a small apartment not far from here. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his chin. It's like she just vanished one day. No leads. No suspects. Nothing. Until now. The weight of his words settled over Claire like a heavy, suffocating blanket. So this means she was here. She was out there. Miller nodded, his expression grim. "It looks that way. And if these bones belong to her, we might finally have some answers about what happened to Lillian Carter." Claire sank into the nearest chair, rubbing her hands together to stop the tremor running through them. The rusted lockbox sat on the table between them, its contents scattered like puzzle pieces she wasn't sure how to fit together. But who buried this? Her voice was barely above a whisper. If she wrote that letter, she was scared of someone. Miller studied the faded pages in his hands, flipping through them carefully. The paper was brittle, aged by time, but the fear in the words was still fresh. She said she didn't know who to trust, he muttered. That means she had reason to believe someone close to her was involved. Could have been a friend. A coworker. A neighbor. A shiver ran down Claire's spine. The thought was almost too much to process. If that's the case, she murmured, then whoever did this might still be around. Miller didn't answer right away. He carefully folded the letter and set it aside, his jaw tight. I need to take all of this back to the station. We'll run tests on the items, see if we can pull any fingerprints or DNA. Claire nodded numbly, but her mind was spinning in 100 different directions. What if there's more out there, she said suddenly. What if the dog knows where it is? Miller's gaze flicked to the dog, who was watching them both intently, his ears perked. It's possible, he admitted. He led you to the bones. And now he's led you to this. If there's anything else. He trailed off, studying the animal with newfound respect. He might be the key to finding it. Claire swallowed hard. Then we should follow him again. Miller frowned. Claire, I don't know if I know it's not exactly protocol, she cut in. But you said it yourself. He's found this much already. What if he can find more? Miller exhaled sharply, clearly considering her words. A long pause. Then, finally, all right. But we do this carefully. I don't want you wandering out there alone. Relief flooded through her. Deal. Miller gathered the items from the lockbox, placing them carefully into an evidence bag before leading the way outside. Claire grabbed the dog's leash, though she had a feeling she wouldn't need it. Because as soon as they stepped out, the dog moved. Fast. Focused. Determined. He knew where they were going. The second box. The air was crisp, the first rays of sunlight barely slicing through the trees as they followed the dog across the uneven ground. Long shadows stretched out before them, distorting their figures like ghosts moving in the half-light. Miller stayed close, his hand resting on his holster. Minutes passed in tense silence, only broken by the soft rustling of leaves beneath their boots. Then, the dog stopped. Tail stiff. Ears forward. Claire's heart shot into her throat. He's found something, she whispered. Miller stepped forward, his eyes scanning the ground. Stay back, he muttered, reaching for his flashlight. He crouched, brushing aside leaves and dirt. A dull metallic glint caught the light. Another box. Claire's pulse pounded in her ears as Miller carefully dug it out. It was similar to the first, rusted, old Loctite. But this one had been buried deeper. Someone wanted to make sure this stayed hidden, Miller muttered. Claire's breath hitched. Open it. Miller pulled out his pocket knife, working at the rusted lock. A soft click. The lid creaked open. Inside, a stack of aged papers. A small notebook. And something wrapped in cloth. Miller unwrapped it first. A knife. Its blade was tarnished with age, its handle worn. But it was still intact. Still sharp. Claire's stomach twisted. Is that a weapon? Miller turned it over in his hands. Could be what killed her. She exhaled shakily, trying to steady herself. In the papers? Miller picked up the notebook, flipping through its pages. His brows furrowed deeper with each turn. It's a journal, he murmured. And from the looks of it, it belonged to Lillian. Claire leaned in, pulse hammering. What does it say? Miller read in silence for a moment. Then he shook his head. It's fragmented. Some pages are missing. But she talks about someone watching her. Following her. She was scared, Claire. Really scared. Then he turned to the last written page. His expression darkened. She wrote, if something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Claire shivered. She knew. Miller exhaled slowly, closing the journal. Yeah. And now it's up to us to find out who did this. The dog let out a low whimper, shifting beside them. Claire glanced down at him. He had brought them this far. Maybe, just maybe, he could take them all the way to the truth. Miller straightened. I'll get this back to the lab. We'll run tests, see what we can pull from the weapon and the journal. Claire nodded, fingers tightening around the leash. And in the meantime? Miller met her gaze. In the meantime, you stay close. I don't think this is over. Claire exhaled, glancing at the dog. His tail wagged just slightly, as if he understood. She knelt beside him, rubbing his head gently. I think we still have more work to do, don't we, buddy? The dog licked her hand. Warm. Steady. A comfort against the unknown that lay ahead. And Claire knew without a doubt. He wasn't done leading her yet. The call that changed everything. Hours later, Claire sat on her couch, the journal open in her lap. The dog lay curled beside her, his head resting on her knee, his quiet breathing the only sound in the room. The weight of the discovery pressed down on her like an anchor. Lillian Carter had been afraid for her life. And now, decades later, the pieces of her story were finally surfacing. But Claire still didn't know why. Her phone vibrated on the coffee table. She jumped. Snatched it up. Miller? No. Unknown number. Her stomach twisted. She hesitated, then answered. Hello. A brief pause. Then, a voice crackled through the line. Low. Rough. Unfamiliar. Claire Holloway. Her blood ran cold. Yes. Silence. Then, you should stop digging. A voice, rough and edged with something unreadable, crackled through the phone. I heard you've been asking about Lillian Carter. Claire's grip tightened. Her pulse pounded. Who is this? Someone who remembers. Someone who's been waiting for the right person to find the truth. A cold chill snaked down her spine. You knew Lillian? A pause. Then, the voice dropped lower. I knew what happened to her. And I know who didn't want anyone to find out. Claire's throat went dry. Who? Midnight. The old mill on Route 6. Come alone. The line went dead. Silence crashed over her. The weight of the call pressed on her chest. Every instinct screamed at her to call Miller to let the police handle it. But deep down she already knew this was the only way. The truth had been buried for 40 years. And now someone was finally willing to talk. The dog lifted his head, watching her carefully, sensing her hesitation. Claire exhaled and ran a steadying hand over his fur. Looks like we're going for a drive. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark. The glow of her headlights carved through the night, casting long, eerie shadows along the cracked pavement. Towering trees loomed on either side, their gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. With every mile, Claire's nerves coiled tighter. The dog sat in the passenger seat, ears perked, body rigid with alertness. He hadn't made a sound since they left, as if he knew they were heading toward something dangerous. As she pulled up to the old mill, the massive structure stood in eerie silence. The once thriving building was now nothing but a husk, rotting wood, rusted metal, shattered windows. Time had swallowed it whole. Claire scanned the lot, fingers gripping the wheel. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. And then movement. A shadow detached from the darkness. Her breath caught. A man. Older. A worn baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Shoulders hunched. He stepped closer, raising a hand in a slow, deliberate gesture of peace. You came. Claire swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. You gave me no choice. He nodded toward the building. We should talk inside. Every instinct screamed a no. But something about him, about the urgency in his voice, kept her rooted in place. The dog stiffened beside her, watching him with cautious eyes. Claire inhaled deeply, then stepped out of the car. Inside, the mill was thick with dust in time. The air smelled of rust, of memories long abandoned. The man turned to face her, his features clearer now. Lined with age. Eyes sharp. Watchful. I used to work with Lillian, he said, voice low. She was a good girl. But she got caught up in something she wasn't supposed to. Claire's arms crossed. What do you mean? His jaw clenched. He took a step closer, voice barely above a whisper. Back in '83, there was a deal that went bad. A man went missing. The people involved wanted to make sure no one asked questions. Lillian, she figured out too much. Claire's heart pounded. Are you saying she was murdered? A slow, solemn nod. And buried where no one was ever supposed to find her. Cold dread slithered through Claire's veins. Who was responsible? The man hesitated. His jaw tightened. Some of them are still around. People with power. People who don't want the past dug up. Claire's breath hitched. If I keep digging. His gaze met hers, filled with quiet warning. It won't stop until they bury you too. The weight of his words pressed down on her, but she couldn't stop now. What can you tell me? Names? Places? Anything? A flicker of something guilt crossed his face. He reached into his coat, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and handed it to her. This is all I have left. Be careful with it. And watch your back. Claire unfolded the paper. A list of names. Some familiar. Some not. And at the bottom an address scrawled in faded ink. Her stomach twisted. This was a trail. A breadcrumb path leading straight to the truth. She looked up, ready to ask more questions. But the man was already backing into the shadows. That's all I can give you, he murmured. And it's more than you should have. Then he was gone. Vanished into the night. Claire stood frozen, the list trembling in her hands. A cold knot of fear tightened in her chest. The dog pressed against her leg, his silent reassurance grounding her. She inhaled sharply and turned toward the car. Whatever she had just stepped into, she wasn't walking away now. Back in the driver's seat, Claire's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The old mill loomed behind her, swallowed by the dark. The list of names burned in her pocket like a loaded gun. The dog sat beside her, watching her carefully, sensing the shift in her energy. She had a choice. Call Miller, bring the police in now, play it safe. Or follow this lead herself. Her gut twisted. If these people still had power, if they'd buried Lillian and gotten away with it for 4 decades. Could she really trust anyone? Could bringing the police in only tip off the wrong people? She exhaled slowly, staring at the dark road ahead. No. There was only one way to find out. She needed to check the address on that list herself. The drive was silent. Just the steady hum of the engine. The empty roads. The weight of the stranger's warning clawing at her brain. They won't stop until they bury you too. She shook the thought away and focused. The address was on the outskirts of town in an industrial district long forgotten. The kind of place where secrets stayed hidden. She turned onto a deserted road. The streetlights grew sparse. The buildings skeletal and broken. Up ahead a rusted chain-link fence. A faded "No trespassing" sign. Beyond it, a decaying building swallowed by time. Her gut clenched. She wasn't the first person to come looking for answers here. She killed the engine. Turned to the dog. Stay close. Then with her heart hammering, she stepped into the dark. A deadly chase in the dark. Claire ran. Her breath came in sharp, uneven gasps as she sprinted through the overgrown path behind the abandoned building. Every muscle in her body screamed, but she couldn't stop, not now. Not when she could still hear the heavy thud of footsteps slamming against the wooden floor inside the mill. They were close. Too close. The dog stayed by her side, silent but alert, his powerful legs carrying him effortlessly through the tangled mess of weeds and dirt. The night air was thick, humid, clinging to her skin like a second layer. A low-hanging branch lashed against her arm, tearing a thin scratch into her forearm, but she barely felt it. Her heart pounded against her ribs, so loud it drowned out everything else. Behind her, a sharp voice cut through the night. There! She's through the fence. Claire didn't look back. She couldn't. If she hesitated for even a second, she was dead. Up ahead, the rusted chain-link fence loomed like a final obstacle between her and freedom. A narrow opening barely wide enough for her to squeeze through was her only way out. She forced herself forward, ducking low as she dived for the gap. The cold metal scraped against her side, snagging on her jacket. She yanked herself free. A jagged edge of rusted wire tore through her sleeve, slicing into her skin. A sharp sting shot up her arm, but there was no time to assess the damage. She hit the ground on the other side with a harsh thud, rolling into the dirt. The dog was already through, ears pinned back, eyes locked onto her. Then gunfire. The first shot cracked through the night like a thunderclap. Claire barely had time to react before a second shot rang out, the bullet striking the metal fence behind her with a sharp, echoing ping. They were shooting now. Not just chasing her. A cold rush of fear flooded her veins. This wasn't about scaring her off. They wanted her dead. The dog let out a sharp bark, low, guttural. A warning. Claire pushed herself up, legs trembling, lungs burning, and forced herself forward. The alley ahead was dark, lined with old warehouses and rusted shipping containers. A perfect maze to lose them. But her car, her only real escape, was parked on the next street over. She darted left, weaving between stacks of abandoned crates, each step a battle against exhaustion. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out everything but the overwhelming need to keep moving. Then headlights. Bright beams flickered on at the end of the alley, cutting through the darkness like a knife. Claire skidded to a halt, heart slamming against her chest. A black SUV idled just ahead, its engine a low, steady hum. Tinted windows. No plates. Someone was inside. Someone waiting. Her breath hitched. Was it them? Another piece of whatever nightmare she just walked into? Then another voice behind her. Closer. She's heading toward the street. Cut her off. A new surge of adrenaline hit her like an electric shock. No. No way in hell. She pivoted sharply, sprinting toward an abandoned loading dock, her boots pounding against the concrete as she vaulted onto the platform. The dog followed without hesitation. Crack. A third gunshot. Sparks flew as the bullet struck the metal railing just inches from her hand. Claire dropped to the ground, pressing herself against the cold steel. Her mind raced. If she ran toward her car now, they'd catch her before she even made it to the next block. She needed a plan. A way to disappear. Her eyes darted around there. A rusted fire escape hung just above her, barely intact but still connected to the skeletal remains of an old factory wall. It was high, too high to reach from the ground. But an overturned wooden crate sat just beneath it, half-rotted but still sturdy enough. She didn't have time to think. She climbed onto the crate, fingers gripping the cold steel bars of the ladder. The metal groaned under her weight, flakes of rust crumbling beneath her hands. The dog let out a sharp bark, a distraction. Another shot rang out. Claire flinched, her heart slamming against her ribs. But she didn't stop. She hauled herself up, scrambling over the ledge just as the men reached the loading dock below. Where's she? Check behind the crates, she's here somewhere. Claire flattened herself against the platform, her breath shallow, muscles locked. She could hear them moving below, quick, sharp footsteps, the scrape of boots against concrete. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to stay absolutely still. A long silence. Then one of them muttered low and frustrated, "Damn it. She's gone." She wasn't. But she would be. Claire waited 1 second, 2, then slowly, carefully, she shifted onto her stomach, peering over the edge. The men had turned their backs, scanning the alleyway, weapons still in hand. This was her chance. She crawled inch by inch toward the far end of the rooftop. Below, a drainpipe ran down the side of the building. It wasn't stable, but it would have to do. She took one last steadying breath, then swung her legs over the edge. The metal was slick with rust, the surface rough against her palms as she slid down, her muscles screaming with effort. The dog whined softly from above, his paws scraping against the rooftop as he searched for his own way down. Claire hit the ground hard, stumbling but staying on her feet. She turned, arms open. "Jump," she whispered. The dog hesitated, then leapt. She caught him barely, his weight nearly knocking her off balance. Then more voices. They had circled around. No time. She ran, the dog close on her heels. The warehouse lot stretched ahead, a dark, endless maze. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of another engine came to life. She wasn't out of this yet. And something told her, this was only the beginning. Claire's lungs burned, her pulse a relentless drum against her ribs as she flattened herself against the damp wood of the stacked crates. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, but she couldn't, not yet. The dog pressed close to her side, his body coiled like a spring, his breath hot against her wrist. She could feel his heart hammering just as fast as her own. They were here. They weren't going to let her leave easily. A beam of light slashed through the darkness, sweeping across the alley like a knife hunting flesh. Claire shrank back, pressing herself deeper into the shadows, every muscle locked tight. The flashlight hovered, lingering just a heartbeat too long, illuminating the grime-covered wood inches from her face before it finally moved on. But the footsteps didn't. Closer now. Heavy. Purposeful. Her stomach twisted as boots scraped against pavement. They weren't searching aimlessly anymore. They knew she was here. Claire swallowed hard, forcing herself to think. If they found her now, there wouldn't be time to run. She had to be smart. Her eyes darted around, searching anything anywhere. The alley stretched toward a narrow side street, but there was no cover. Running into the open? Suicide. Up. Her gaze snapped to a rusted fire escape a few feet away. The metal was corroded, its bolts barely clinging to the brick, but it was high enough to get her out of reach. She had no choice. Bending down, she whispered, "Follow me." She moved fast, low to the ground, her fingers brushing the dog's fur as she reached for the ladder. The first rung was just out of reach. Heart pounding, she gritted her teeth, planted a foot on an old crate, and jumped. Her fingers barely caught the edge. The metal groaned, flakes of rust crumbling beneath her grip. She hauled herself up. The dog leapt onto the first landing with ease, his paws silent against the steel. Claire climbed as fast as she dared, every creak of the ladder sending ice-cold fear through her veins. Below, shouting, "She's here! She's going up!" A gunshot ripped through the night. The bullet struck the fire escape with a deafening clang, sending a vibration through the metal beneath her hands. Claire flinched but didn't stop. Her foot slipped on the last step, her body lurched, but strong hands caught the railing just in time. With a final push, she dragged herself onto the rooftop, rolling onto her back, gasping for air. The dog was already beside her, ears pinned back, eyes locked on the alley below. Claire swallowed hard and crawled forward. Peering over the edge, she saw them, 2 men in dark jackets, flashlights sweeping wildly, weapons still drawn. She has to be up there. She couldn't have gone far. Frustration laced their voices, their movements sharp, agitated. One of them kicked over a crate, sending it clattering against the pavement. "She's gone." The other cursed under his breath, scanning the rooftops with narrowed eyes. "She won't get far." Claire held her breath, every muscle rigid, waiting. They wouldn't leave. Not really. They'd pull back, regroup, but they'd still be watching. Only when their footsteps finally faded into the distance did she exhale, her body trembling from the adrenaline crash. The dog nudged her with his nose, his quiet concern grounding her. "We need to move," she murmured, forcing herself up. Before they double back, they made their way across the rooftop, navigating carefully, every step deliberate. Another fire escape led down to a quieter street. Claire hesitated before descending, scanning the area below. No movement. She climbed down fast, the dog landing beside her as they hit the pavement. Her car was parked just a block away. If she could get to it, she had a chance. Claire moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, pulse still racing. Every corner felt like a trap. Every window a pair of unseen eyes. She needed answers. She needed them now. Reaching her car, she checked the street one last time before slipping inside. The dog jumped in beside her, curling into the passenger seat. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel. She exhaled sharply, then reached into her pocket, pulling out the crumpled note. The list of names stared back at her, the address scrawled at the bottom like a final, inescapable pull towards something she wasn't sure she was ready to face. No turning back now. She started the engine and drove, leaving the alley behind, unaware that she was being watched. The truth was waiting. The city streets grew darker, more desolate, the buildings giving way to abandoned warehouses and hollow motels forgotten by time. The road ahead was empty, the silence pressing against her like a weight. Claire's grip on the wheel tightened as the address led her to the farthest edge of town. The house sat alone at the end of a gravel driveway, barely visible beneath the glow of a flickering streetlight. The paint on the wooden panels peeled like dead skin. The windows were dark. But the front door, it was open. A chill crawled up her spine. She killed the engine, the night swallowing the sound instantly. Beside her, the dog lifted his head, ears twitching. His body was still, but Claire could feel it. He was on edge. Her stomach twisted. Someone had been here. Maybe they still were. Stepping out of the car, she moved cautiously, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots the only sound in the still night. The air smelled of dust and damp wood, of something old and forgotten. She hesitated at the doorway. The silence inside was suffocating. With a steadying breath, she pushed the door open. The hinges groaned in protest. A dim glow from a half-broken lamp cast shadows along the floor, stretching across the sparse furniture like reaching hands. An old couch. A coffee table littered with yellowed newspapers. A single wooden chair near the window. The dog padded forward, nose twitching. A framed photo sat on the table, its glass cracked. Claire picked it up. A young woman. Lillian. Her stomach twisted. This had been her house. Then a sound. Soft. Barely there. A shuffle of movement from the back of the house. Claire's pulse spiked. Her fingers clenched around the frame. She turned, muscles coiled tight, eyes scanning the dark hallway ahead. Then a shadow moved. Her breath hitched. Someone was here. "Who's there?" she called softly. No answer. The dog let out a low rumbling growl. Claire followed his gaze. A slightly open door. A faint glow flickering inside. Bracing herself, she moved forward. Step by step. The door creaked as she pushed it open. A man sat at a desk, hunched over a pile of papers. His face was partially hidden in shadow, but as he slowly lifted his head, Claire's stomach clenched. He had been waiting for her. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice even. Claire straightened, jaw tight. "Neither should you." The man exhaled slowly, shifting in his seat. His sharp eyes studied her, unreadable. "You don't know what you've stepped into." Claire's pulse thundered in her ears. "I know Lillian lived here." His expression darkened. "And I know she's dead." Claire's breath was shallow, her pulse a relentless hammer against her ribs. She knew Lillian was afraid, terrified of something. Or someone. And now, standing in this dimly lit room, staring down a man whose jaw had just tightened at her words, she knew the truth. Someone wanted her gone. The air between them thickened, heavy with something unsaid. Claire took a step closer. The man's eyes darkened, a muscle in his jaw twitching. "She was too close," he muttered. Then, meeting Claire's gaze, he added, "Just like you are." A shiver ran through Claire's spine like ice water. She forced herself to stand her ground. "Then tell me." For a long, suffocating moment, the man just studied her, his face unreadable. Then, with a heavy sigh, he reached for the stack of papers on the desk and pushed them toward her. "Lillian found records," he said, voice low but firm. "Names. Dates. Proof of people involved in something they didn't want exposed." He swallowed. She tried to run. Tried to tell someone. But they caught her before she could. Claire's breath hitched. Her fingers curled into fists. Caught her. She swallowed hard. So she was murdered. The word fell like a stone between them. The man's eyes flickered with something anger? Regret? He exhaled sharply. And buried where no one would find her. He paused. Until now. The weight of it all pressed against Claire's chest. She gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself, her mind spinning. Who did it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man shook his head. That's the problem. You're dealing with people who don't leave evidence behind. People who have spent decades covering their tracks. His gaze was hard now. If you dig too deep, you'll end up just like her. Claire's stomach twisted into knots. She had known this was dangerous, but hearing it spoken aloud sent ice through her veins. So why are you still here? She asked, forcing her voice to stay steady. If you know how dangerous this is? The man leaned back, his expression unreadable. Then after a beat he said, because I've spent years trying to bring them down. And I can't do it alone. Claire clenched her fists. She didn't hesitate. Then tell me what to do. The man hesitated. Just for a moment. Then slowly he reached for a single sheet of paper and slid it across the desk. There's a storage facility, he said. East side of town. Unit 43. If there's any proof left, it's there. Claire took the paper, her pulse racing. Her fingers tightened around it. This was it. The next step. What about you? She asked. The man exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I'll keep digging. His voice dropped, a warning beneath his breath. But you need to be careful. They're watching. A sudden noise outside. Both of them froze. The dog's ears perked up, his body stiffening. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Then the unmistakable sound of a car engine idling just outside the house. A fresh wave of panic surged through Claire's chest. The man stood abruptly. Go. Now. Claire didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed the paper and backed toward the door. The dog was already ahead of her, his instincts driving him toward the exit. Be careful, the man said, one last time. Then he turned back to the desk, his shoulders squared as if bracing himself for whatever came next. Claire slipped out into the night, her heart hammering. The air was colder now. Heavier. Like unseen eyes were pressing in on her. She reached the car, barely pausing before she yanked open the door and climbed inside. The dog jumped in beside her, ears still alert. She jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. As she pulled onto the road, the headlights cast long, jagged shadows against the pavement. Her hands were still shaking. She had come looking for answers. And now she had more than she knew what to do with. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Lillian anymore. She wasn't just uncovering a murder. She was exposing something much bigger. And someone out there was willing to do anything to keep it buried. Claire kept glancing at the rearview mirror as she drove. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The road ahead stretched into darkness, but it was the shadows behind her that made her pulse race. Someone had been outside that house. Watching. Waiting. The dog sat beside her, his body tense. He sensed it too, the danger lurking just beyond what she could see. She reached over, absently running her fingers through his fur. His presence was the only thing keeping her grounded. She needed to get to the storage facility. Now! The paper burned in her grip, the address seared into her mind. East side of town. Unit 43. Whatever truth Lillian had uncovered. Whatever secrets had gotten her killed. They were there. And Claire wasn't about to stop now. She pressed harder on the gas, speeding through the empty streets. The city felt eerily quiet, the streetlights casting warped, distorted shadows along the pavement. Her mind raced. Lillian had been close. Too close. And now Claire was in the same position. The only difference? She had the dog. She glanced at him again. He had led her to the bones. To the lockbox. To the truth no one wanted found. Had he been with Lillian before she disappeared? Had he been waiting all these years for someone to follow the trail she left behind? A shiver ran through Claire's spine. She pulled into the lot of the storage facility and killed the engine. The place was deserted. The only light flickered weakly from a single street lamp near the entrance. Rows of metal doors stretched out before her, silent keepers of long-buried secrets. She checked the paper again. Unit 43. Stepping out, the gravel crunched beneath her boots. The dog stayed close, his body pressed against her leg like he knew they were walking into something dangerous. She moved carefully, scanning the rows of storage units for any sign of movement. The lock on Unit 43 was rusted but intact. Claire reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around the key. She hesitated, then slid it into the padlock. A click echoed in the still night as it popped open. She exhaled sharply. With one last glance over her shoulder, Claire grasped the handle and pulled the metal door up. It groaned loudly, the sound scraping against the silence. Inside, darkness. She flicked on her flashlight. The beam sliced through the dust-filled air, illuminating the space. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with old boxes and files, decades of forgotten records. A wooden desk sat in the center, cluttered with yellowed papers. And in the middle of it all, a single unopened envelope. Claire stepped inside, her breath tight in her chest. The dog followed, his ears twitching, his body low to the ground, sensing the weight of something unseen. The air was thick, stale with the scent of mildew, dust, and old paper, a forgotten place frozen in time. Every footstep sent tiny clouds of dust swirling into the beam of her flashlight. The walls seemed to press in, heavy with secrets. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the envelope on the desk, its edges yellowed, the ink on the front neat, deliberate. Lillian Carter. The name hit her like a fist. A dead woman's final words. A message from the past, waiting to be read. She swallowed hard and tore it open, carefully unfolding the single sheet inside. The message was brief, but every word slammed into her like ice down her spine. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. But they won't stop. Find the ledger. It's the only proof. Trust no one. Claire's breath hitched. Her hands shook as she lowered the letter. The ledger. That had to be what Lillian had been gathering, the records she had risked her life for. Proof of something huge. Something dangerous. Something worth killing over. She turned, scanning the dimly lit room, her heart pounding in her ears. If the ledger was here, she had to find it fast. She ripped open a nearby box, rifling through stacks of old bank statements and legal documents, her pulse hammering with each useless page. She moved to the next, then the next, her panic rising. Where was it? Had it already been taken? Then a growl. Low. Dangerous. The dog's body went rigid, his gaze locked on the entrance. Claire froze. A sound. Footsteps. Slow. Purposeful. Someone was here. She flicked off the flashlight and pressed herself against the shelves, holding her breath. The dog stayed close, tense, unmoving, his instincts razor-sharp. The footsteps grew louder. A shadow passed by the open door, stretching across the floor like a specter. Claire swallowed hard. Then a man stepped inside. Tall. Dark clothing. A cap pulled low over his face. He moved with precision, his sharp eyes scanning the room like he already knew what he was looking for. Claire didn't move. Neither did the dog. They watched in silence, waiting. The man strode toward the desk. His gloved fingers ghosted over the papers, brushing aside the same records Claire had just searched. He let out a quiet sigh, as if disappointed. Then he reached into his jacket. Claire tensed, her mind racing. A gun? A knife? No. A lighter. Her blood turned to ice. The man flicked it open. A small flame flared to life, illuminating his face for the briefest moment before he dropped it onto the desk. Claire's heart stopped. The fire caught instantly. Flames curled hungrily over the papers, licking at the records, devouring them in seconds. The man turned without a word, vanishing into the night as quickly as he had come. Claire lunged forward, panic surging through her veins. She grabbed at the nearest stack of papers, desperate to save anything, but the heat rose fast. Too fast. The fire was relentless, spreading in wild, twisting tongues of orange and red, consuming everything in its path. She had no choice. She had to get out. Snatching the letter, she turned and ran. The dog was right beside her, matching her step for step. The flames chased them, a roaring inferno threatening to swallow them whole. The cold night air hit her like a slap as she stumbled out into the lot. Behind her, the fire raged inside the unit, sending thick plumes of smoke into the sky. Her chest heaved. Her mind raced. The ledger. If it had been here, it was gone now. Reduced to ashes. But she still had the note. And she wasn't giving up. She turned, eyes narrowing as she scanned the darkness. Someone was watching. She could feel it, a presence just beyond her sight. Whoever was trying to bury this secret had just made a mistake. They had underestimated her. And she was just getting started. Her hands still trembled as she climbed into the car, her pulse a deafening drum in her ears. The dog sat beside her, his body tense, his ears flicking at every distant sound. Even he could feel it, the weight of what had just happened, the threat still lingering in the air. Claire gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. Someone had followed her. Someone had been waiting. And now the proof, the one thing that could have exposed the truth, was gone. But she still had the letter. She pulled into a deserted parking lot a few miles away, killing the engine. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind raw exhaustion and the gnawing chill of reality. She sucked in deep breaths, forcing herself to think, to process. The ledger wasn't in the storage unit. If it had been, it was nothing but cinders now. Which meant, it had to be somewhere else. Claire's mind raced, searching for any detail she might have missed. And then it hit her. Lillian's house. The realization sent a fresh surge of energy through her veins. Maybe Lillian had hidden it before she was silenced. Maybe she had known this would happen. Claire shoved the note back into her pocket and started the car. The fire had been meant to scare her, to make her back off. But all it did was fuel her resolve. She wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The road back to Lillian's house stretched before her like a tunnel of darkness. The last time she had been there, she'd left in a hurry, chased away by unseen threats, by the suffocating weight of something dangerous lurking just beneath the surface. But now? Now she was going back on her own terms. She pulled up to the curb and shut off the engine. The house stood in the dim glow of the streetlight, its windows dark, its walls heavy with secrets. It looked the same as before. But something felt different. The air around it felt charged, thick with something unspoken. Beside her, the dog let out a low whine, shifting restlessly in the passenger seat. Claire reached over, running a hand down his back. "I know, buddy," she murmured. "But we have to do this." She grabbed her flashlight and climbed out of the car, scanning the empty street. Silence. Just the distant hum of the wind rattling through the abandoned neighborhood. She approached the house cautiously, her every step measured. The dog stayed close, his body tense, ready. The door was still ajar from before, creaking on its hinges as she pushed it open the rest of the way. The stale air inside wrapped around her, thick with dust in time. She flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a house frozen in the past. The old furniture. The scattered papers. The framed photos staring back at her from the walls. Everything was exactly as she had left it. But she wasn't here for what was in plain sight. She needed to go deeper. Claire tore through the study like a storm, yanking open drawers, flipping through stacks of old files, rifling through books on the shelves, searching, desperate. Every empty drawer, every useless document, every wasted second made her pulse hammer harder. The ledger had to be here. It had to be. She exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temples. Think, Claire. If you were hiding something that could get you killed, where would you put it? Her gaze swept the room again, but this time she forced herself to see it differently, to see it through Lillian's eyes. The desk? Too obvious. The shelves? The first place someone would look. Then her eyes dropped to the floor. The rug? Heart pounding, she dropped to her knees, grabbing the edges of the rug and throwing it back. The hardwood beneath looked smooth, except for one plank. Slightly misaligned. Worn in a way the others weren't. Her breath caught. Fingers trembling, she pressed down on the edges, feeling for movement. It gave, just slightly. Claire swallowed hard, wedging her fingertips beneath it and prying it up. The board groaned, then lifted free. There. A small dust-covered metal box. Claire's hand shook as she pulled it from the floor and placed it in front of her. The dog sniffed at it, tail wagging slightly, as if sensing this was important. It was. It had to be. She swiped a layer of dust from the lid and unlatched it. The hinges groaned as she lifted it open, revealing neatly bound pages, handwritten notes, and records. Names. Transactions. Secrets. The ledger. Lillian had hidden it. She had known it wasn't safe. And now, after all these years, Claire had found it. But before she could fully process what she was holding, a floorboard creaked behind her. Claire froze. The dog's ears pricked forward, his body going rigid. A shadow shifted in the doorway. Someone was there. Watching. Claire's breath hitched in her throat as she slowly turned, her pulse pounding so hard it nearly drowned out the silence. The dim glow of her flashlight cast long, flickering shadows across the walls, catching the figure's silhouette. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Dressed in dark clothing. The dog let out a low growl, shifting into a defensive stance. The man took a slow step forward, boots creaking against the wooden floor. You really don't know when to quit, do you? His voice was low. Amused almost. But there was something else beneath it. Something sharp. Dangerous. Claire's grip on the ledger tightened. Who are you? The man tilted his head slightly like he was considering his answer. Let's just say I know what you have. And I can't let you keep it. Claire's stomach clenched. Why? Because it proves the truth? Because it names names? The man let out a dry chuckle. The truth isn't the problem. It's what people will do to keep it buried. The dog barked a sharp warning sound. The man didn't flinch. Smart animal, he muttered. But this isn't a fight you can win. Claire's mind raced. He was blocking the only exit. Running wasn't an option. But she wasn't about to hand the ledger over. Her eyes darted to the heavy lamp on the desk. Within reach. The man took another step forward. Hand it over. Now. Claire didn't hesitate. In one swift motion, she grabbed the lamp and hurled it at him. It wasn't heavy enough to do real damage, but it was enough to make him flinch. That was all she needed. She bolted. The dog lunged, snapping at the man's legs as Claire tore past him. She clutched the ledger tightly, sprinting for the front door. Behind her, she heard the man curse. A loud crash followed. She didn't dare look back. The front door loomed ahead. She slammed into it, twisting the knob, yanking it open. Cold night air hit her like a slap. Her car was parked just down the street. If she could make it. A hand clamped around her wrist. Claire twisted, using every ounce of strength she had. The man's grip was iron tight, but she wasn't going down without a fight. She kicked out. Her boot connected with his shin. He grunted, his grip loosening just enough. She wrenched herself free. She ran. The dog stayed close, growling as they sprinted for the car. Claire yanked the door open, throwing herself inside. The dog leapt in right after her. She slammed the door shut just as the man reached the curb. His hand smacked against the window. You don't know what you're getting into. Claire ignored him. She jammed the key into the ignition, turned it. The engine roared to life. The man took a step back as she floored the gas pedal. Tires screeched against the pavement. His figure blurred in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. She didn't stop driving until she was miles away. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel. The dog sat beside her, panting, his eyes locked on her like he was waiting for her to say something. She exhaled sharply, clutching the ledger tighter. We did it, buddy, she whispered. We found it. But the battle wasn't over. Now she had to figure out what to do next. The night felt colder than before as Claire drove through the winding streets, her mind racing in sync with the hum of the engine. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights tailing her. But the road remained empty. Still, she wasn't stupid. The danger wasn't over. The ledger sat on the seat between them, its worn cover looking almost ordinary under the dim glow of the car's interior lights. But she knew better. Inside those pages were secrets that could unravel everything. Names. Dates. Proof of corruption and cover-ups buried for decades. She thought about the man who had confronted her. He had been serious. Maybe even desperate. And that made him even more dangerous. She couldn't go home. She couldn't trust anyone. Not yet. Because now the hunt wasn't just about the ledger. Now they were hunting her. She needed time. Time to think. Time to breathe. Time to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do next. But time was the one thing she didn't have. The dog let out a low whine, the sound soft but insistent, pulling her back from the spiral of panic tightening around her mind. His ears flicked, and his dark eyes stayed on her, full of a quiet, steady patience. Claire reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she scratched behind his ears. He was warm, solid, real. The only thing that felt stable in a world that had started crumbling around her. It's okay, boy, she murmured, though the words tasted like a lie. We'll figure this out. But how? She had no map, no clear next step. The only thing guiding her now was raw instinct, the same gut feeling that had screamed at her to run. To get away from the familiar streets, away from the creeping paranoia that had settled over her like a second skin. So she drove. Past the neon glow of the city, past the towering glass and steel that made up its skyline. The further she went, the more everything around her thinned. Traffic became sparse, buildings turned into scattered structures, and soon, the streetlights gave way to darkness. The road stretched ahead of her like an unspooling ribbon, flanked by towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. Her hands clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles white. She kept driving. Until she saw it. A diner standing alone at the edge of nowhere. She pulled into the empty lot, the crunch of gravel beneath her tires breaking the suffocating silence. The place looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. The sign above the entrance was missing letters, its faded paint peeling from years of neglect. The windows were coated in grime, and the door, just barely ajar, creaked against the wind. Her pulse quickened. She shut off the engine, letting the night settle in around them. Silence. No cars. No voices. Just the whisper of wind through the trees and the rhythmic thump of her own heartbeat. The dog didn't move, his body tense beside her. He felt it too, that heavy weight in the air, that unshakable feeling that she wasn't as alone as she wanted to be. Claire swallowed hard and reached for the ledger. She flipped it open, her fingers brushing against the old, brittle pages. Inked names stared back at her, some she recognized, most she didn't. Until she did. Her breath hitched. Not just local officials. Not just small-town power players. These names carried weight. Politicians. Corporate executives. High-ranking members of law enforcement. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just a scandal. This was something bigger. Something that stretched far beyond the borders of her small town. Lillian must have known. She must have realized just how dangerous this information was. And now Claire was the one holding it. A sharp chill ran down her spine. She ran a finger along the edge of the paper, mind racing. If she took this to the authorities, would they help? Or would they bury it? If she went to the press, would they publish it? Or would it disappear before the truth ever saw the light of day? The dog nudged her arm again, a quiet, grounding presence. She exhaled shakily. You always know when I need a reality check, huh? He wagged his tail, but his eyes never left her face. Then her phone buzzed. The sharp vibration made her flinch. She grabbed it off the dashboard, staring at the screen. Unknown number. Her breath caught. This wasn't a coincidence. This was deliberate. Her hands tightened around the device, the cool glass pressing into her fingertips. Her thumb hovered over the answer button. Every instinct screamed at her not to pick up. But she did. Pressing the phone to her ear, she forced her voice to stay steady. Hello. The voice on the other end was smooth. Measured. Unnervingly calm. Claire Holloway. Her stomach dropped. Her grip on the phone tightened. Who is this? A beat of silence. Then. Let's just say I'm someone who wants to help. Every muscle in her body tensed. How do you know my name? A pause. Then the voice answered, chilling in its certainty. Because we've been watching. The air in the car turned ice cold. Her gaze flicked to the ledger. They knew. They knew what she had. Her fingers curled into a fist. How do you know that? The voice remained maddeningly calm. Because you've stirred up something that was meant to stay buried. And there are people who would do anything to keep it that way. Claire's heartbeat pounded against her ribs. But the voice continued, there are also people who want the truth to come out. She could feel it now, the unshakable sense that she was standing on the edge of something irreversible. Why should I trust you? She asked, her voice low. A pause. Then. You shouldn't. Her pulse roared in her ears. But you also can't do this alone. Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then the voice gave her an address. Somewhere unfamiliar. It's a safe house, they said. No one will know you're there. Bring the ledger. Claire opened her mouth to demand more answers, but before she could, the line went dead. Static hummed softly in her ear. She lowered the phone slowly, staring out at the dark road ahead, her mind spinning. A safe house. Someone who could help. Or another trap. The dog nudged her again, his warm presence anchoring her back to reality. She scratched behind his ears absently, her voice barely a whisper. What do you think, boy? He wagged his tail. Not excited. Just certain. Claire took a slow, deep breath. Then she gripped the steering wheel and turned the key in the ignition. The engine growled to life. With the ledger beside her, she pulled back onto the road, driving straight toward the unknown.